The headlights of my beat-up Honda Civic cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but an endless stretch of empty highway. I'd been driving for hours and the fuel gauge needle was hovering dangerously close to empty. Just as panic started to set in, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. "Gas," it read. I breathed a sigh of relief, not knowing that in a few short minutes I'd be wishing I'd taken my chances running out of gas instead. The station looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1950s and dropped into the present day. A single pump stood sentinel in front of a small building with peeling paint and windows so grimy I couldn't see inside. As I pulled up, the gravel crunched loudly under my tires, sounding more like breaking bones than rocks. I killed the engine and stepped out, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the neon sign and the ping of my engine as it cooled. I reached for the pump, but it was so old it didn't have a credit card reader. Great, I'd have to go inside. The bell above the door jangled as I entered, the sound piercing in the silence. The inside of the store was as run down as the exterior, with dusty shelves holding expired snacks and faded magazines. Behind the counter stood a man, if you could call him that. He was tall and impossibly thin, his skin so pale it seemed almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and when he smiled, his teeth were yellow and crooked. But it wasn't his appearance that made my skin crawl. It was the way he looked at me. His gaze was hungry, predatory, like a wolf eyeing a wounded deer. "Evening," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to slither across the room. "What can I do for you?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just need to fill up. Pump number 1. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "That'll be $40. I fumbled with my wallet, my hands shaking slightly as I counted out the bills. As I handed them over, his cold fingers brushed against mine, and I had to suppress a shudder. He didn't move to the register, just stood there, holding the money and staring at me. Is there a problem?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. He tilted his head, reminding me of a bird of prey. "No problem, just wondering what brings a young thing like you out here so late at night. These roads can be dangerous, you know." I forced a smile, trying to appear braver than I felt. "Just passing through. Need to get back on the road as soon as possible." He chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "No need to rush. Why don't you stay a while? We don't get many visitors out here." "Thanks, but I really should get going," I said, backing towards the door. His smile widened, showing more of those yellowed teeth. "Suit yourself. But be careful out there. You never know what kind of creatures might be lurking in the dark." I practically ran out of the store, my heart pounding in my chest. The cool night air felt good on my flushed face as I made my way to the pump. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the nozzle into the tank. As I stood there, watching the numbers slowly tick up, I felt the weight of eyes on me. I glanced towards the store and saw the attendant's face pressed against the grimy window, his sunken eyes fixed on me. I quickly looked away, focusing on the pump and willing it to go faster. Finally, the pump clicked off. I replaced the nozzle and screwed the gas cap back on, my movements quick and jerky. As I reached for my car door, a sound made me freeze, the jingle of the store's bell. "Wait!" the attendant called out, his raspy voice carrying across the lot. "You forgot your receipt." I turned slowly, my hand still on the door handle. He was standing just outside the store, a small slip of paper held out in front of him like an offering. His smile was wider now, almost manic. "That's okay," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't need it." He took a step forward, then another. "Oh, but I insist. We wouldn't want you to get in trouble for not having proof of purchase now, would we?" Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get in the car and drive away, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation. Here I was, terrified of a man offering me a receipt. Or maybe it was the growing certainty that if I tried to leave, things would get much, much worse. So I stood there watching as he crossed the lot towards me with slow, deliberate steps. In the harsh glow of the overhead lights, his skin looked even more pallid, almost glowing. As he got closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a dark stain on the front of his shirt, just over his heart. He must have seen me looking because his grin widened impossibly further. "Had a little accident earlier. he said, gesturing to the stain. "Clumsy customer. You're not clumsy, are you?" I shook my head mutely, my throat too dry to speak. He was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could smell him, a sickly, sweet odor of decay barely masked by cheap cologne. He held out the receipt, and I reached for it with trembling fingers. As I took it, his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His skin was ice cold and felt wrong somehow, like touching wet leather. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "it gets awfully lonely out here. Been a long time since I've had any company." I yanked my arm back with all my strength, finally breaking free of his grasp. Without thinking, I swung my car door open, hitting him squarely in the chest. He stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and I took the opportunity to dive into my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. In my rearview mirror, I saw the attendant regaining his balance, that horrifying grin still plastered on his face. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into drive, peeling out of the lot in a spray of gravel. As I sped away, I glanced in my mirror one last time. The attendant was standing in the middle of the road, watching me go. And then, just for a second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the glow of my taillights, his shadow stretched out behind him, but it wasn't the shadow of a man. It was something large, misshapen, with too many limbs and what looked like wings. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just a normal human shadow on the pavement. But I knew what I'd seen, and I pressed the accelerator to the floor, desperate to put as much distance between me and that gas station as possible. For hours, I drove without stopping, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every set of headlights behind me made my heart race, convinced it was him somehow following me. It wasn't until the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, that I finally began to relax. I pulled over at a rest stop, my whole body aching from the tension of the night. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I remembered the receipt still clutched in my hand. I smoothed it out, half expecting to see some sort of cryptic message or symbol, but it was just a normal receipt showing the amount I'd paid for gas. And at the bottom, in faded ink, was a message. "Thanks for stopping by. Hope to see you again soon." I crumpled the paper and tossed it out the window, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. As I pulled back onto the highway, I made a solemn vow to myself. From now on, I'd make sure my tank was always full before driving at night. And if I ever saw another old, isolated gas station in the middle of nowhere, I'd keep driving until I ran out of gas. Because sometimes the monsters lurking in the dark are all too real. And sometimes they wear human faces and offer you receipts with smiles that are just a little too wide. The neon "open" sign flickered in the diner's grimy window, a beacon of hope on this desolate stretch of highway. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with fatigue, when I spotted it. Little did I know I was about to step into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. Only 2 other cars were there, an old pickup truck and a sedan that had seen better days. As I killed the engine, the silence of the night pressed in around me. No crickets, no distant traffic, just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stretched as I got out of the car, my joints popping in protest after the long drive. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of impending rain. In the distance, lightning flickered, illuminating the outline of mountains against the inky sky. The diner's door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. A bell jangled overhead, announcing my arrival to no one, apparently. The place was deserted. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their stuffing poking through worn patches. A jukebox in the corner stood silent, its lights dark. The counter stretched the length of the diner, dotted with chrome-edged stools. Everything looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the empty space. No response. I slid onto one of the stools at the counter, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. A laminated menu sat in front of me, its edges curling and yellow with age. I flipped it open, more out of habit than hunger. My stomach was too knotted with an inexplicable unease to feel hungry. That's when I noticed the coffee cup. It sat a few stools down, steam still rising from its surface. Someone had been here recently? Very recently. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" The kitchen door behind the counter swung open and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A waitress emerged, her appearance so sudden it was as if she had materialized out of thin air. She was an older woman, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, looked as dated as the diner itself. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. They were pale, almost colorless, and seemed to look right through me. "What can I get you, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy and low. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off my unease. "Just coffee, please, Black." She nodded and turned to the coffee maker behind her. As she poured, I couldn't help but notice how stiffly she moved, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. She set the cup in front of me without a word, then retreated to the far end of the counter where she began wiping it down with a rag. The repetitive motion was almost hypnotic, back and forth, back and forth. I took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at its bitter, burnt taste. But I needed the caffeine to help me make it through the rest of my drive, so I forced myself to drink it. As I sat there, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned to look out the window and froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. There, just at the edge of the parking lot, stood a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but something about its stance seemed off, unnatural. As I watched, it took a step forward, then another, moving with a jerky, disjointed gait. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I looked again, the figure was gone. "Everything all right, hon?" the waitress asked, suddenly right next to me. I hadn't heard her approach. I jumped, nearly spilling my coffee. I thought I saw someone outside," I stammered. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, that's just old Joe. He likes to wander around at night sometimes. Nothing to worry about." Her words did nothing to calm me. If anything, they only heightened my sense of unease. Who was old Joe, and why was he lurking around a deserted diner in the middle of the night? I glanced at my watch, surprised to see that nearly an hour had passed since I'd entered the diner. It had felt like only minutes. "I should get going," I said, reaching for my wallet. "How much for the coffee?" The waitress waved her hand dismissively. "On the house, hun. You look like you could use it." I muttered a thank you and slid off the stool, my legs feeling oddly stiff. As I made my way to the door, I felt the waitress's eyes on me, boring into my back. Just as I reached for the handle, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. For a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. My heart raced, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then the lights came back on and I gasped. The diner had changed. The vinyl booths were now torn and moldy, stuffing spilling out onto the floor. The linoleum was cracked and peeling, revealing rotting floorboards beneath. And the smell, oh God, the smell. It was the stench of decay, of things long dead and forgotten. I spun around looking for the waitress, but she was gone. In her place at the far end of the counter stood a group of figures. They were shrouded in shadow, their features indistinct, but I could feel their eyes on me. As I watched, frozen in terror, they began to move towards me. Their movements were wrong, jerky, and uncoordinated, like broken puppets. And as they got closer, I could see that their bodies were in various states of decay. I yanked the door open and ran, not daring to look back. The gravel slipped under my feet as I sprinted to my car. I could hear them behind me, a chorus of rattling breaths and the scrape of dragging feet. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before finally managing to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. As I jammed the key into the ignition, I looked up and screamed. They were there, surrounding my car. Rotting faces pressed against the windows, hands, some little more than bone, scrabbled at the doors. The engine roared to life and I floored it, not caring about the figures in my way. I felt bumps as I hit something, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky that I finally eased off the accelerator. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I pulled over at the first rest stop I saw, collapsing against the steering wheel as soon as I put the car in park. Sobs racked my body as the full weight of what had happened hit me. When I finally calmed down enough to lift my head, I caught sight of something on the passenger seat that made my blood run cold. It was a napkin from the diner, yellowed and brittle with age, and scrawled across it in shaky handwriting were 5 words: "Come back soon, we're waiting." I threw the napkin out the window and peeled out of the rest stop, my tires squealing on the asphalt. I drove straight through to my destination, not stopping for anything. Even now, years later, I can't drive past a roadside diner without breaking into a cold sweat. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering about that diner. Was it real? Did I imagine the whole thing in some sort of stress-induced hallucination? But then I remember the napkin, the faces at my car window, the smell of decay, and I know it was real. I don't know what that place was. A portal to another dimension, a trap for unwary travelers, or something even more sinister. But I do know one thing: if you're ever driving late at night and you see a lonely diner on a deserted stretch of road, keep driving. No matter how tired you are, no matter how much you need a cup of coffee, keep driving, because you never know what might be waiting for you inside. And once you enter, you might never truly leave. The rusty chains of the swing set creaked in the night breeze, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. I should have kept driving, should have trusted my gut when it told me something was off about this place. But exhaustion and a nagging bladder had won out, and now I found myself facing a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. It had started innocently enough. I was on a solo road trip crossing the country to start a new job on the opposite coast. The romance of the open road had worn off somewhere around hour 14 of driving that day, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and an urgent need for a restroom. When I spotted the sign for a rest area, I nearly cried with relief. It was well past midnight, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. The exit ramp loomed ahead, a promise of blessed relief and maybe a quick nap before continuing my journey. As I pulled into the parking lot, the first inkling of unease crept over me. The place was deserted, which wasn't entirely unexpected given the hour, but there was something about the stillness that felt wrong. The air seemed thicker here, pressing down on me as I stepped out of my car. The restroom building stood to my right, a squat concrete structure that had seen better days. To my left, barely visible in the dim light of a single flickering lamppost, was a small playground. The sight of it gave me pause. Who puts a playground at a highway rest stop? But nature was calling insistently, so I pushed my misgivings aside and made my way to the restroom. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I did my business as quickly as possible, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the graffiti-covered stall door in front of me. As I washed my hands, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the restroom was empty. Just my imagination, I told myself. Too many hours on the road and too much gas station coffee. I stepped back outside, taking deep breaths of the cool night air to calm my nerves. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of children's laughter. My head snapped towards the playground. The swing set stood silent and still, no sign of the phantom laughter I'd heard. But as I watched, one of the swings began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed as if pushed by invisible hands. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The logical part of my brain insisted it was just the wind, but a deeper, more primal part knew better. This was something else entirely. As if in a trance, I found myself walking towards the playground. The crunch of gravel under my feet seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie silence that had fallen. As I got closer, I could make out more details in the dim light. The playground equipment was old, far older than it should have been for a modern rest stop. The metal was pitted with rust, the paint peeling away in large flakes. And yet there was something off about the decay. It looked deliberate somehow, as if the playground had been engineered to appear abandoned and forgotten. I reached the edge of the play area, my feet sinking slightly into the sand that surrounded the equipment. The swing was still moving, its chains creaking rhythmically. Up close, I could see that the seat was worn smooth, as if from years of use. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared even to my own ears. "Is anyone there?" The swing slowed to a stop. For a moment, all was silent. Then from somewhere behind me came the sound of a child giggling. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing but shadows. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to sound stern but hearing the tremor in my voice. "Who's out there?" Another giggle, this time from a different direction. Then another and another. Soon the playground seemed to be filled with the sound of children laughing, the noise growing louder and more frenzied with each passing second. I backed away, my feet tangling in the sand. As I stumbled, my hand brushed against the cold metal of the swing set. The moment I made contact, the laughter cut off abruptly, plunging the night into an oppressive silence. Then I saw them. They emerged from the shadows like ghosts, their forms flickering and insubstantial in the weak light. Children, a dozen or more, surrounding the playground. But these were no ordinary children. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint blue tinge that spoke of long submersion in cold water. Their eyes were dark, empty voids that seemed to swallow what little light there was. And their clothes? Their clothes were from another era entirely. Frilly dresses and short pants, the kind you'd see in photographs from the early 1900s. They stood perfectly still, watching me with those bottomless eyes. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror. But my body wouldn't respond, held captive by their unearthly gaze. One of the children, a little girl with long dark hair, took a step forward. Her mouth opened in a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "Play with us," she said, her voice a horrible rasp that sounded nothing like a child's. "We've been so lonely." The others began to move then, advancing slowly but inexorably towards me. Their feet made no sound on the sand, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they weren't touching the ground at all. They were floating, drifting towards me like leaves on an unseen current. I managed to take a stumbling step backward, then another. My back hit something solid. The slide, I realized dimly. I was trapped. The ghostly children were almost upon me now, their cold hands reaching out. I could feel the chill emanating from them, like standing in front of an open freezer. The little girl with the sharp teeth was in the lead, her eyes fixed hungrily on my face. In that moment, survival instinct finally overcame paralyzing fear. I ducked under her outstretched arms and ran, my feet slipping in the sand. I could hear them behind me, their laughter once again filling the air, but I didn't dare look back. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. As I threw myself into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of the playground in my rearview mirror. The children were there, standing at the edge of the sand. They weren't laughing anymore. They were watching me, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And they looked hungry. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't slow down until I was back on the highway. The rest stopped nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. For hours I drove without stopping, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Every shadow on the road seemed to hide ghostly faces, every sound the echo of that terrible laughter. It wasn't until the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, that I finally began to relax. I've never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a playground out of the corner of my eye, or hear the distant sound of children laughing, and the terror comes rushing back. I don't know what those things were at the rest stop. Lost souls, malevolent spirits, something even worse. But I do know this. I'll never stop at a deserted rest area again, no matter how desperately I need to. And if I ever see a playground that looks just a little too old, a little too abandoned, I'll turn and run the other way. Because sometimes the ghosts of the past are all too eager to play, and their games are not the kind you want to join. The rearview mirror showed nothing but an endless stretch of empty road behind me. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Little did I know my instincts were right, and I was about to embark on the most terrifying drive of my life. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup. Just me, my old Chevy, and the open road. I'd been driving for hours, the sun long since set, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of tires on asphalt and the faint glow of dashboard lights. The first sign that something was off came when I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. Nothing unusual about that, except I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car on this desolate stretch of highway. As I watched, the headlights grew larger, closing the distance between us at an alarming rate. I eased my foot onto the accelerator, increasing my speed from a leisurely 65 to a more urgent 75. The speedometer needle had barely settled when the headlights behind me matched my pace, maintaining their distance with unnerving precision. "It's fine," I muttered to myself, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "They're probably just in a hurry. They'll pass soon enough." But they didn't pass. For miles, those headlights stayed fixed behind me, never falling back, never drawing closer, just there, watching, waiting. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call. Who? The police? What would I even say? "Hello, officer. I'm being followed by a car that isn't actually doing anything threatening." I'd sound insane. Besides, my phone showed no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. A green mile marker flashed by, and I did some quick mental math. The next town was still over an hour away. An hour of empty road with nowhere to turn off, nowhere to hide. I chanced another glance in the rearview mirror and felt my heart skip a beat. The headlights were closer now, close enough that I should have been able to make out the shape of the car behind them. But there was nothing, just two floating orbs of light hanging in the darkness like disembodied eyes. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple as I pressed the accelerator further, pushing my old car to speeds it hadn't seen in years. The engine protested with a high-pitched whine, but I ignored it, focused solely on putting distance between me and whatever was behind me. For a moment it seemed to work. The headlights fell back, shrinking in my mirror. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief, which caught in my throat as the lights suddenly surged forward, closing the gap in seconds. They were so close now that their glow filled my car, casting long, shifting shadows across the dashboard. I could feel the heat of the lights on the back of my neck, impossibly intense, as if the sun itself was tailgating me. In desperation, I yanked the wheel to the right, intending to pull onto the shoulder and let my pursuer pass. But as I did, the headlights swerved with me, staying directly behind as if attached to my bumper by an invisible tether. "What do you want?" I screamed, knowing they couldn't hear me but unable to stay silent any longer. "Why are you doing this?" As if in answer, the lights flickered, once, twice. Then they went out completely. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived, because in the next instant I realized I could still see the road ahead, illuminated by a pale, otherworldly glow coming from behind me. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I tilted the rearview mirror down. There was a face pressed against my back window. Not a human face, not even close. It was featureless, smooth as polished bone, with deep black hollows where the eyes should be. As I watched, frozen in horror, a crack appeared where the mouth would be, widening into a grin that split the face nearly in half. I screamed then, a primal sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. My foot slammed down on the accelerator, pushing it all the way to the floor. The car shot forward with a roar, the speedometer needle burying itself past 100. The landscape outside became a blur, trees and rocks whipping by so fast they melded into a solid wall of darkness. But no matter how fast I went, that pale face remained fixed in my mirror, its terrible grin never wavering. I don't know how long I drove like that, time losing all meaning in the face of mind-numbing fear. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was the roar of the engine, the vibration of the car threatening to shake itself apart, and that ever-present face in my mirror. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the face vanished. I blinked, certain I must be hallucinating, but no, the mirror showed nothing but empty road behind me. The otherworldly glow was gone, leaving me in darkness broken only by my headlights. Cautiously, I eased off the accelerator, half expecting the face to reappear the moment I slowed down. But nothing happened. The road remained empty, silent but for the gradual ticking of my overtaxed engine as it cooled. As my heartbeat slowly returned to something approaching normal, I became aware of a faint glow on the horizon. Civilization. I'd never been so happy to see the distant lights of a town in my life. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the ignition. As I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, a tap on my window nearly sent me through the roof. It was an older man, his face creased with concern. "You all right there, son?" he asked as I rolled down the window. "You came in awful fast, looked like you saw a ghost." I opened my mouth, intending to laugh it off, to say I was fine. But instead, the whole story came pouring out. The headlights, the face, the terrifying chase. To his credit, the old man listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully on his lower lip. "You ain't the first to come through here with a story like that," he said finally. "Been happening for years, always on that same stretch of road." What is it?" I managed to ask. He shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's the ghost of a hitchhiker who was killed out there. Others think it's something older, something that was here long before us, and will be here long after we're gone." He paused, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "Whatever it is, it's best not to drive that road at night, especially not alone." I nodded, too drained to do anything but accept his words. As he turned to go, a thought struck me. "Wait," I called after him. How do I know it's really gone?" The old man turned back, his eyes sad. "You don't," he said simply. "But if I were you, I'd check my back seat before I started driving again, just to be sure." With that, he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of dread. Slowly, I turned in my seat, my eyes drawn to the shadowy interior of my car's back seat. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a slight movement caught my eye. There, nestled among the fast food wrappers and discarded water bottles, was a small scrap of something pale. With trembling fingers, I reached back and picked it up. It was a piece of smooth, white material, cool to the touch and slightly damp. As I turned it over in my hands, realization dawned, bringing with it a fresh wave of terror. It was a fragment of a featureless face, curved in a permanent, mocking grin. I dropped it with a yelp, scrambling out of the car so fast I nearly fell. As I stood there, gasping for breath in the fluorescent glare of the gas station lights, I knew one thing for certain. My road trip was over. I didn't care if I had to sell my car and buy a plane ticket, or if I had to walk across the country. Because there was no way in hell I was getting back on that highway. Not tonight. Not ever again. Sometimes the things that follow us in the dark don't stay on the road. And sometimes the real horror isn't the chase, it's the moment you realize it might not be over after all. The headlights appeared out of nowhere, twin beams cutting through the fog like searchlights. At first, I was relieved to see another car on this desolate stretch of road. But as the minutes ticked by and those lights remained fixed in my rearview mirror, relief gave way to an unshakable dread. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a night that would push me to the very edge of sanity. It had been a long day of driving, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional pit stop for gas and stale coffee. I was on my way to my sister's wedding, a last-minute road trip necessitated by a missed flight and a desperate need to not disappoint my only sibling on her big day. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of tires on asphalt and the faint glow of dashboard lights. The fog had rolled in thick and fast, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond my headlights. I'd slowed to a crawl, straining to make out the faded yellow lines that were my only guide through the murky darkness. That's when I first noticed the headlights behind me. At first, I was grateful for the company. The fog felt less oppressive knowing there was another soul braving these treacherous conditions. But as the minutes stretched into a half hour, then an hour, with those lights maintaining a constant distance behind me, unease began to creep in. I checked my speedometer, 35 miles per hour, slow but reasonable given the conditions. Yet the car behind me matched my speed perfectly, never falling back, never drawing closer, just there. Probably just using me as a guide through the fog, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. I decided to test my theory. Gradually, I eased my foot off the accelerator, slowing to a crawl. The headlights behind me dimmed, matching my deceleration with eerie precision. Heart pounding, I sped up again. The lights grew brighter, surging forward to maintain that same unchanging distance. "Okay, this is getting weird," I said aloud, my voice sounding small and frightened in the confines of the car. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call. Who? The police? What would I even say? "Hello, officer. I'm being followed by a car that's matching my speed but not actually doing anything threatening." I'd sound insane. Besides, my phone showed no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. A green mile marker flashed by, barely visible through the fog. I did some quick mental math. The next town was still over 2 hours away, 2 hours of empty road with nowhere to turn off, nowhere to hide. I chanced another glance in the rearview mirror. The headlights seemed closer now, though it was hard to tell through the swirling mist. Were they bigger, brighter, or was my fear playing tricks on me? Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I cranked up the air conditioning, needing to do something, anything, to distract myself from the growing panic clawing at my chest. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The headlights behind me weren't reflecting off the fog the way they should. They cut through it like lasers, two perfect beams that seemed to pierce the mist without diffusing. "That's not possible," I whispered, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As if hearing my words, the headlights flickered. Once, twice, then they split, dividing into 4 lights, then 8, then 16, multiplying like cells under a microscope. I blinked hard, certain I must be hallucinating. When I looked again, the lights had reformed into 2, but now they were tinged with a sickly green glow that reminded me of bioluminescent algae I'd once seen on a beach at night. "This isn't happening," I said, my voice rising in pitch. "This can't be happening." But it was. And it was about to get worse. The radio, which had been silent for hours due to lack of signal, suddenly crackled to life. Through a haze of static, I could make out a voice, low, gravelly, and somehow wrong. "Pull over," it growled. "Pull over now." I jabbed at the power button, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit it. The voice cut off mid-word, leaving me in blessed silence once more. But the reprieve was short-lived, because now the headlights were moving. They swayed from side to side like the head of a predator sizing up its prey. Then they began to rise, lifting higher and higher until they were level with my rear window. I floored the accelerator, no longer caring about the fog or the slick road. The engine roared in protest as I pushed it to speeds it was never designed for. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands, the whole car feeling like it might shake itself apart at any moment. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was putting distance between me and whatever was behind me. For a moment it seemed to work. The lights fell back, shrinking in my mirror. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief, which caught in my throat as the lights suddenly surged forward, closing the gap in seconds. They were so close now that their glow filled my car, casting long, shifting shadows across the dashboard. I could feel the heat of the lights on the back of my neck, impossibly intense, as if the sun itself was tailgating me. In desperation, I yanked the wheel to the right, intending to pull onto the shoulder and let my pursuer pass. But as I did, the lights swerved with me, staying directly behind as if attached to my bumper by an invisible tether. "What do you want?" I screamed, knowing they couldn't hear me but unable to stay silent any longer. "Why are you doing this?" As if in answer, the radio crackled to life again. This time, instead of a voice, there was a sound that made my skin crawl, a high-pitched keening, like metal scraping against metal, undercut by a deep rhythmic thumping that sounded disturbingly like a massive heartbeat. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the noise. But it seemed to be coming from inside my head now, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Through tear-blurred eyes, I saw a sign looming out of the fog. "Rest area, 1 mile." It was the first exit I'd seen in hours, and I seized on it like a drowning man grasping at a life preserver. I took the exit at speeds that sent my car fishtailing wildly. Tires squealed as I careened into the rest area parking lot, coming to a stop in a spray of gravel. I killed the engine and sat there, gasping for breath, waiting for the glow of those terrible headlights to fill my mirrors once more. But they never came. Slowly, cautiously, I turned to look out the back window. The road behind me was empty, nothing but swirling fog as far as I could see. I slumped in my seat, relief washing over me in waves. It was over. Whatever it was, whatever had been chasing me, it was gone. That's when I noticed the man standing next to my car. He was tall, unnaturally so, his head level with the roof of my sedan. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you might see in a black-and-white photograph from the 1920s. But it was his face that made my heart stop. He didn't have one. Where his features should have been was nothing but smooth, pale skin, broken only by 2 round, glowing circles where his eyes should be. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, a crack appeared where his mouth should be. It widened into a grin that split his face nearly in half, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. A sound escaped me then, a whimper of pure animal fear. The thing's head snapped towards me, those glowing eyes fixing on mine with terrible intensity. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and from it came a voice I recognized, the same gravelly growl I'd heard on the radio. "Found you," it said. I don't remember starting the car. I don't remember peeling out of that rest area, gravel spraying behind me. The next thing I clearly recall is seeing the sun rise on the horizon, my gas tank nearly empty, my hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel for hours on end. I never made it to my sister's wedding. I never drove at night again. And to this day, whenever I see headlights in my rearview mirror, I feel a chill run down my spine. Because sometimes the things that follow us in the dark aren't content to stay on the road. And sometimes when you think you've escaped, you've actually driven right into their trap. The rumble of the diesel engine was the only sound for miles, a constant companion on this lonely stretch of highway. But as the night wore on, that familiar noise began to change, taking on an otherworldly quality that sent chills down my spine. Little did I know I was about to encounter a legend of the road that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I'd been driving for what felt like days, though in reality it had only been about 14 hours. As a long-haul trucker, I was used to marathon drives, but this one was pushing even my limits. The sun had long since set, leaving me alone with nothing but the glow of my dashboard lights and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. My eyelids were getting heavy, the white lines on the road beginning to blur together. I knew I should pull over, catch a few hours of sleep at the next rest stop, but I was behind schedule, and the promise of a fat bonus for an early delivery was too tempting to pass up. Just a few more hours, I told myself. I could make it. That's when I first noticed the truck. It appeared in my side mirror without warning, a massive black silhouette that seemed to materialize out of the darkness itself. I hadn't passed anyone in hours, and I was certain the road behind me had been empty just moments before. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. It was an old model, probably from the 50s or 60s, with a long hood and rounded fenders. The kind of truck you'd see in a vintage photograph, not on a modern highway. But it was the driver that really caught my attention, or rather, the lack of one. The cab was empty. I blinked hard, certain I must be seeing things. The lack of sleep was getting to me, playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked again, the driver's seat was still vacant, the big rig seemingly driving itself. A chill ran down my spine as the phantom truck pulled alongside me. Its engine had a strange sound to it, a deep rhythmic thumping that reminded me more of a heartbeat than machinery. The noise seemed to vibrate through my whole body, setting my teeth on edge. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to pull ahead, but no matter how fast I went, the old truck matched my speed effortlessly, staying right beside me like we were connected by an invisible tether. That's when things got really weird. The truck's headlights flickered, then went out completely. For a moment it was swallowed by the darkness. Then slowly a pale blue glow began to emanate from the grille, pulsing in time with that unnatural engine sound. I watched, transfixed, as tendrils of glowing mist began to seep from the truck's seams. They writhed and twisted in the air, reaching out towards my rig like ghostly fingers. "This isn't happening," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. "I'm asleep. This is just a dream." But I knew it wasn't. The fear coursing through my veins was too real, the pounding of my heart too loud in my ears. I fumbled for the radio, desperate for some human contact, some reassurance that the world hadn't gone completely mad. But all I got was static, punctuated by bursts of what sounded like old-time trucking songs, distorted and warped until they were barely recognizable. As I fiddled with the dial, a voice suddenly cut through the static. It was deep and gravelly, with an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "Pull over, friend," it growled. "It's time to rest." I yanked my hand away from the radio as if it had burned me. The voice chuckled, a low, menacing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't outrun me, boy," it said. "I've been on these roads longer than you've been alive, longer than roads have existed." I risked a glance at the phantom truck. The cab was no longer empty. A figure sat behind the wheel. shrouded in shadows so deep they seemed to absorb the light around them. All I could make out were 2 pinpricks of blue fire where its eyes should be. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned its head towards me, those fiery eyes boring into mine. "I've had many names over the years," it said, "but most folks just call me the Phantom Trucker." As it spoke, the mist pouring from the truck began to take shape, forming spectral images that flickered and changed like an old movie reel. I saw snapshots of highway accidents, twisted metal and broken bodies, lonely truckers falling asleep at the wheel, their rigs careening off cliffs or into oncoming traffic. "I'm the one who comes for those who push too hard," the Phantom Trucker continued. "The ones who think they can cheat sleep, cheat fate. I'm the price of hubris on the open road." My blood ran cold as I realized what he was saying. This thing was death itself, or at least some aspect of it, and it had come for me. "No," I said, shaking my head violently. "No, I'm not ready. I have a family, people who depend on me. I can't—" "Can't what?" the Phantom Trucker interrupted. "Can't die? Everyone does sooner or later, and you, my friend, have been tempting fate for far too long." As if to emphasize his point, my eyelids suddenly felt like they weighed a ton. The road in front of me blurred, the white lines melding together into a hypnotic pattern. I jerked the wheel, overcorrecting and nearly sending my rig into a spin. "See?" the ghostly voice said, sounding almost sad. "It's already happening. Why fight it? Just pull over, close your eyes, let the long sleep take you." Part of me wanted to give in. I was so tired, so very tired. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad just to rest. But then I thought of my wife waiting for me at home. My kids who still needed their dad. The life I'd built. The dreams I still wanted to fulfill. "No," I said again, this time with more force. "I'm not going out like this. Not today." I stomped on the brakes, the sudden deceleration throwing me forward against my seatbelt. The Phantom Truck shot past me, its spectral mist dissipating in the night air. For a moment I thought it was over. Then I saw the big rig's brake lights flare to life, glowing with that same eerie blue light. It was coming back. In that moment, fueled by desperation and adrenaline, I made a decision that could have easily killed me. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending my truck careening off the highway and down the steep embankment beside it. The world became a chaos of motion and noise. My rig bounced and shuddered, threatening to tip over with each impact. Bushes and small trees snapped under the wheels, the cracking sounds like gunshots in the night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I came to a stop at the bottom of the hill. The engine was dead, steam hissing from under the crumpled hood, but I was alive. Shaking, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stumbled out of the cab. The hill I'd just descended loomed above me, impossibly steep in the darkness. At the top, I could see the glow of headlights as cars continued down the highway, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But there was no sign of the Phantom Truck. I sank to my knees in the damp grass, my whole body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. I'd done it. I'd escaped. As the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky, I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. For a moment, fear gripped me again. But it was just a regular tow truck, probably called by some passing motorist who'd seen my tracks leading off the road. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, helped me up the hill. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, shaking his head as he surveyed the path of destruction my rig had left. "What happened?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I explain what I'd experienced? Who would believe me? I fell asleep at the wheel, I said finally. It wasn't entirely a lie. The man nodded sympathetically. "Happens to the best of us," he said. "The important thing is you survived. Someone up there must be looking out for you." As he helped me into the cab of his truck, I couldn't help but glance back at the highway. For just a second, I thought I saw a flicker of blue light in the distance, heard the faint echo of an otherworldly engine. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had all been real or just a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But real or not, the experience changed me. I never drove drowsy again, no matter how tempting the bonus or how tight the deadline, because I knew that somewhere out there the Phantom Trucker was still roaming the highways, and next time I might not be lucky enough to escape. The smell hit me first, acrid like burning rubber mixed with something sickeningly sweet. I rolled up my window, but it didn't help. The stench seemed to seep through every crack in my old Civic. That should have been my first warning. But I was tired, my eyes strained from hours of driving down winding mountain roads. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty, an angry orange light reminding me of my predicament. I needed gas, and I needed it soon. The faded wooden sign appeared suddenly around a sharp bend. "Welcome to Millhaven, population 207. Below it, someone had crudely spray-painted "Last stop 100 miles." I had no choice. I steered onto the narrow road leading into town, gravel crunching under my tires. Millhaven looked like it had been forgotten by time. Weathered, clapboard buildings lined the main street, their paint peeling in the harsh mountain sun. Not a soul was in sight, but I felt eyes on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I pulled into the run-down gas station at the end of the street. The pumps looked ancient, all analog dials and rusted metal. No card reader in sight. I sighed, resigning myself to going inside to pay cash. A bell jingled discordantly as I pushed open the door. The interior was dimly lit, shelves stocked with dusty cans and faded packages. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as old and worn as the town itself. His roomy eyes fixed on me, but he didn't speak, just stared. Hi," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. "Could I get $30 on pump 1, please?" The old man's gaze didn't waver. His tongue darted out, licking cracked lips. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry rasp. "Cash only." I nodded, pulling out my wallet. As I counted out the bills, I noticed his hands, gnarled with yellowed nails curved into claws. A faint tremor ran through them as he reached for the money. Our fingers brushed as I handed over the cash. His skin felt like old leather, cold and dry. I suppressed a shudder. "You passing through?" he asked, still not breaking eye contact. I nodded. "Just need to fill up and I'll be on my way." His lips curled into what might have been a smile, revealing stained teeth. "Shame," he said. "We don't get many visitors round here. Might be nice if you stayed a spell." A chill ran down my spine despite the stuffy heat of the store. "Thanks, but I really need to get going," I said, backing towards the door. "Long drive ahead." The old man's smile widened. "Suit yourself," he said, "but do be careful on them roads after dark. Never know what might be waiting out there." I mumbled a thanks and practically bolted out the door. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in vivid oranges and reds. I needed to get out of here fast. As I filled up my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes darted around, but the street remained empty. Just as I finished and was about to get back in my car, I heard it. A low, keening wail that raised the hair on my arms. It sounded almost human, but distorted, filled with pain and something else I couldn't identify. I whipped my head around, trying to locate the source. There, movement in an upstairs window of the building across the street. A pale face pressed against the glass, mouth open in a silent scream. Our eyes met for a split second before the figure vanished, yanked back into darkness. My heart pounding, I jumped into my car and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. Panic started to set in as I realized the sun had nearly set. Twilight was falling fast, shadows lengthening across the empty street. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It was probably just the battery. I'd pop the hood, take a look, and be on my way in no time. As I got out of the car, I noticed the change in the air. The streets were no longer empty. Figures had appeared in doorways and alleys, their features hidden in shadow. They stood unnaturally still, all facing my direction, watching. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. With shaking hands, I opened the hood and peered inside. Everything looked normal, but I was no mechanic. I jiggled a few wires, praying for a miracle. A sound behind me made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I turned slowly. An old woman stood there, so close I could smell her, a cloying scent of decay and something metallic. Her skin was pale and papery, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, but it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. Milky white, without iris or pupil, yet somehow fixed directly on me. "Car trouble, dearie?" she asked, her voice reedy and thin. "Such a shame, but don't you worry, we'll take good care of you here in Millhaven." I stammered out a response, something about AGA and being fine on my own. But more figures were emerging from the shadows now, men and women of all ages moving with an unsettling synchronicity, all with those same blank white eyes. The old woman reached out a bony hand. "Come along now," she said. "Night's falling, isn't safe out here after dark." I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm fine, really," I said. I'll sleep in my car tonight and get help in the morning." A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. The old woman's lipless mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "Oh no, dearie," she said. "We insist." I turned to run, but strong hands grabbed me from behind. I struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. There were too many of them. As they dragged me towards one of the dilapidated buildings, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The face in the window, a young woman, her eyes wide with terror. She mouthed something at me. A warning? But before I could make it out, I was pulled inside. The door slammed shut behind us with a sickening finality. The interior was pitch black. I could hear breathing all around me, feel the press of bodies. The stench was overwhelming, that same burnt rubber smell from earlier, but stronger now, mixed with copper and rot. A match flared to life, illuminating the old woman's face in hellish orange light. She grinned at me, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Welcome to Millhaven, dearie," she said. "You'll never want to leave." The others began to laugh, a wet, gurgling sound that was anything but human. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them for what they truly were. Twisted, malformed creatures that only vaguely resembled people. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that echoed off the walls. But there was no one to hear, no one to help. The old woman leaned in close, her fetid breath hot on my face. Now, she cooed. "No need for that. You're home now." I felt a sharp pain in my neck and the world began to spin. As consciousness slipped away, I had one last coherent thought. I should have paid attention to that first warning, the smell, the wrongness of this place. But it was too late now. I belonged to Millhaven. And Millhaven, I realized as darkness claimed me, was hungry. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart racing. Sweat plastered my shirt to my back as I looked around wildly, trying to orient myself. I was in my car, pulled over on the side of a mountain road, the engine idling softly. Through the windshield, I could see the first pink streaks of dawn painting the sky. A dream. It had all been a horrible dream. Relief washed over me, leaving me weak and shaky. I must have been more tired than I realized and pulled over to rest my eyes for a moment. I scrubbed a hand over my face, willing my pulse to slow. The dream had felt so real. I could still smell that acrid, burning scent. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I tilted the rearview mirror towards me. There, just visible above the collar of my shirt, were 2 small puncture marks. As I stared in horror, a sign appeared around the bend ahead. "Welcome to Millhaven, population 208. The headlights appeared in my rearview mirror just as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon. At first, I thought nothing of it, just another traveler on this lonely stretch of highway. But as the minutes ticked by and the distance between us remained unchanged, a creeping unease began to settle in my gut. Little did I know this was only the beginning of a night that would haunt me for years to come. I'd been on the road for hours, making my way across the country for a new job opportunity. The monotony of the drive had lulled me into a trance-like state, my mind wandering as the miles rolled by. But now, fully alert, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The car behind me wasn't just following, it was matching my every move. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down, always maintaining that same unsettling distance. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just using me as a pace car, letting me watch for cops or deer. It wasn't that unusual, right? But as the darkness deepened and the road stretched endlessly before me, that explanation felt increasingly hollow. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as I checked the mirror again. The headlights hadn't moved, 2 piercing beams cutting through the night. I couldn't make out the make or model of the car. It was just a dark shape, featureless and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call someone, anyone. But as I glanced down at the screen, my heart sank. No signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and the occasional copse of trees. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air blasting from the AC. I was being paranoid, surely. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life. It was the stuff of urban legends and campfire stories, not something that happened to regular people on regular road trips. But then why couldn't I shake this feeling of dread? I spotted a sign up ahead, a rest stop, 2 miles. My gas gauge was hovering just above a quarter tank. I hadn't planned on stopping so soon, but now it seemed like my best option. Surely my mysterious tail wouldn't follow me off the highway. As I flicked on my turn signal and began to decelerate, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The headlights remained steady, showing no signs of slowing down or changing course. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. See? Just paranoia. They were continuing on their way, and I'd be able to take a breather, maybe grab a coffee, and laugh about how I'd worked myself up over nothing. But as I took the exit ramp, my relief evaporated. The headlights followed, taking the same sharp turn off the highway. My pulse quickened, blood rushing in my ears. This was no coincidence. No random traveler would have any reason to take this exit, miles from any town or attraction. They were following me, deliberately. The rest stop came into view. A small, poorly lit parking lot with a single squat building housing restrooms and vending machines. At this hour, it was deserted. I pulled into a spot near the building, my tires crunching on loose gravel. As I cut the engine, I realized I was trembling. What now? I couldn't just sit here waiting for whatever this was. The headlights swept across the parking lot as the other car turned in. I hunched down in my seat, peering over the dashboard. It was an old model, boxy and dark, maybe navy blue or black. It was hard to tell in the dim light. The windows were tinted, obscuring any view of the driver. It pulled into a spot a few spaces down from me, engine rumbling to a stop. And then, nothing. No movement, no doors opening. Just oppressive silence broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the pounding of my own heart. Minutes stretched by like hours. I was paralyzed, unable to move or think clearly. Should I make a run for the building, try to drive away? But what if they were faster? What if they caught up to me on the open road with no witnesses around? A metallic click broke the silence. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the driver's side door of the other car slowly swing open. A figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered. In the harsh glare of the parking lot lights, I could make out dark clothing but no distinguishing features. They stood there for a moment, head turning slowly as if surveying the area, and then they began walking towards me. Panic surged through me, finally spurring me into action. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a shadow fell across my driver's side window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed out of the space. In my peripheral vision, I saw a hand reach for the door handle, but I was already moving, shifting into drive and flooring the accelerator. The car leapt forward and I took the exit from the rest stop at a dangerous speed, fishtailing slightly as I merged back onto the highway. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, waiting for those headlights to appear again. But the highway behind me remained dark and empty. I drove like that for what felt like hours, always checking, always waiting for them to catch up. But they never did. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever that had been, whoever had been following me, I'd lost them. I was safe. I pulled over at the next town I came to, a small place just waking up for the day. The local diner was open and I stumbled in on shaky legs, ordering the largest coffee they had. As I sat there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Blown an innocent coincidence out of proportion? But then I noticed something. A small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My blood ran cold as I approached the car, plucking it free with trembling fingers. In neat block letters it read, "Nice driving. See you again soon." I crumpled the note in my fist, looking wildly around the quiet street, but there was no sign of the dark car, no mysterious figure watching from the shadows. Yet as I got back in my car to continue my journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that somewhere out there on some dark and lonely stretch of road, those headlights would appear in my rearview mirror once again. I've driven thousands of miles since that night, crossed state lines, changed cars, even moved to a new city. But I've never been able to shake the paranoia that followed me home from that highway. Every time I see headlights in my mirror, steady and unchanging, my pulse quickens. Every dark parking lot feels like a trap, and I can never quite bring myself to fully relax behind the wheel, always waiting, always watching for the return of that phantom vehicle. Because deep down I know the truth. It wasn't coincidence or imagination. Someone was out there that night, someone who chose me for reasons I'll never understand. And the most terrifying part? They're still out there, waiting, watching, ready to resume the chase. So if you're ever driving late at night and notice a car behind you matching your every move, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Just drive, and pray they don't catch up. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Rotten eggs and something metallic like old pennies. It seeped through the vents of my beat-up Corolla, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. But it wasn't until I saw the truck that I realized true fear. I never should have taken that shortcut. It was supposed to be a simple cross-country move. Pack up my life in Boston, drive to San Francisco, start fresh. The GPS said it would take about 45 hours, but I figured I could do it in 3 days if I pushed myself. That was my first mistake. By the second day, I was running on caffeine and determination. The monotony of the highway had started to get to me, endless fields and unremarkable towns blurring together. So when I saw a sign advertising a scenic route that would shave 2 hours off my trip, I didn't hesitate. The sun was setting as I turned off the main highway. The road narrowed, winding through dense forest. It was beautiful in an eerie sort of way. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. That's when the smell hit me. At first, I thought I might have run over something, a skunk maybe, but it got stronger with each passing mile until it was almost unbearable. I tried opening the windows, but that only made it worse. I was debating whether to turn back when I saw the truck. It appeared suddenly around a bend, headlights blazing, a massive semi, easily twice the size of any I'd seen before. The cab was a dull red, oxidized and pitted like it had been through hell, but it was the driver that made my blood run cold. His face was illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard, gaunt with skin so pale it was almost translucent. But his eyes, God, his eyes. They locked onto mine as he passed, and I swear they were glowing. A sickly yellow like jaundice or sulfur. I shuddered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Just some weirdo, I told myself. Probably high on something, nothing to worry about. But then I checked my rearview mirror. The truck had turned around. It was behind me now, gaining fast. Panic surged through me. I pressed down on the accelerator, but my little Corolla was no match for the raw power of that semi. The roar of its engine filled my ears as it drew closer. I fumbled for my phone, cursing as I saw there was no signal. Of course not. I was in the middle of nowhere on some godforsaken back road that probably wasn't even on most maps. The truck was right on my bumper now. I could see the driver's face clearly in my mirror, that unnatural glow from his eyes casting shadows across his hollow cheeks. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying over the thunder of the engines. Suddenly, he swerved into the oncoming lane. For a split second, I felt relief. Maybe he was just an impatient driver eager to pass, but he didn't go around me. Instead, he pulled up alongside, matching my speed. I risked a glance over. The driver was staring at me, that lipless mouth now stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile. He raised one hand from the steering wheel and pressed it against the window. His fingers were impossibly long, ending in sharp points that looked more like talons than human nails. As I watched in horror, they began to sink into the glass, leaving deep scratches in their wake. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that was swallowed up by the night. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but it was useless. The truck kept pace effortlessly, that hideous face never leaving mine. We came to a sharp curve in the road. I took it as fast as I dared, tires squealing in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to lose control. But somehow I managed to stay on the road. The truck wasn't so lucky. Its massive bulk couldn't handle the turn at that speed. I watched in my mirror as it fishtailed, then toppled over with an ear-splitting crash. I didn't slow down. I drove like the devil himself was chasing me, which, for all I knew, he was. It wasn't until I saw lights ahead, a small town, thank God, that I finally eased off the gas. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer as I pulled into the first gas station I saw. An old man was outside, sweeping the already immaculate sidewalk. He looked up as I practically fell out of my car. "You all right, miss?" he asked, concern etching his weathered face. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled sob. The old man's eyes widened as he took in my disheveled state. "Come on inside," he said gently. "Let's get you calmed down." He led me into the small convenience store attached to the gas station. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness of the forest, making me squint. The old man, his name tag read Earl, sat me down on a plastic chair and pressed a bottle of water into my hands. "Now," he said, pulling up another chair. What happened? It all came pouring out of me then. The shortcut, the smell, the truck, the driver with his glowing eyes and impossible fingers. By the time I finished, I was shaking again, tears streaming down my face. Earl was quiet for a long moment, then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. "You saw the demon trucker," he said softly. I blinked at him, uncomprehending. "The what?" "It's an old story around these parts," Earl explained. "A trucker who made a deal with the devil for immortality. But the devil tricked him, trapped him on that road for all eternity. They say he tries to drag others down with him to share his fate." I shook my head, unable to process what I was hearing. "But that's just a story, right? A legend?" Earl's eyes met mine, and I saw a deep sadness there. "You tell me, miss, you're the one who saw him." A chill ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to argue, to insist that there had to be a rational explanation. But before I could speak, a familiar smell wafted through the store. Rotten eggs and old pennies. Earl's face went pale. "Oh no," he whispered. Outside, I heard the rumble of a massive engine. Headlights swept across the windows, bathing the store in a sickly yellow glow. "He's never come into town before," Earl said, his voice trembling. "What did you do to rile him up so bad?" But I was beyond hearing. My eyes were fixed on the door, watching as a shape appeared behind the glass, tall and gaunt with fingers like knives. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, and the demon trucker stepped inside. His eyes found mine immediately, that sulphurous glow piercing right through me. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel being crushed. "Found you," he rasped. "Time to pay the toll." I backed away, bumping into shelves of snacks and drinks. Earl had disappeared, fled or hiding, I didn't know. The demon trucker advanced, each step leaving scorch marks on the linoleum floor. The smell was overpowering now, making my head spin. "Please," I whimpered. "I don't understand. What do you want?" He grinned, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Your soul," he said simply, "to join me on the endless road." I closed my eyes, certain this was the end. But then I felt something being pressed into my hand. Earl had reappeared beside me, and in my palm was a small silver cross. "The power of faith," he whispered urgently. "It's the only thing that can stop him." Without thinking, I thrust the cross towards the demon trucker. He hissed, recoiling as if burned. His form seemed to waver like a mirage in the desert. "No," he snarled. "You can't." But I pressed forward, the cross held out before me like a shield. The demon trucker's body began to dissolve, turning to mist before my eyes. With a final bone-chilling shriek, he vanished completely. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, gasping for breath, the cross clutched tightly in my fist. Earl put a steadying hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." I nodded numbly, unable to fully process what had just happened. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion hit me like a truck. A normal one, thankfully. Earl insisted I stay the night in town, even called ahead to the local motel to arrange a room for me. As I was leaving the store on shaky legs, he pressed the silver cross into my hand. "Keep it," he said, "for protection. And maybe think about taking the main roads from now on." I've been in San Francisco for 6 months now. Sometimes late at night I still catch a whiff of that smell. Rotten eggs and old pennies. When I do, I clutch the silver cross that hangs around my neck and whisper a quiet prayer. Because I know the truth now. The roads are not always safe, and sometimes the shortcuts we take can lead us straight into hell.